Good evening, I'm Dr. Vincent Bacon, Director of the Wheaton College Center for Applied Christian Ethics. This is our last event of the year. It's a great event because Dr. George Harinck is here to talk about the Barmen Declaration and National Socialism. The reason that I'm excited about this lecture is because in 2003, I remember talking to Dr. Harinck about an address he gave in Kampen in the Netherlands, and I said, "Oh, what was your topic?" And he said, "I said that the Barmen Declaration had nothing to do with National Socialism." And then this was as I was getting off the train, and I remember thinking, "Okay, what just happened?" So, and I had a chance to learn a little bit about Dr. Harinck's views, and I'm glad that he's here to present them. It's pretty convincing, I think. So he is a professor of history at Free University of Amsterdam and the director of the Historical Documentation Center for Protestantism since 1800. And it's great for him to be here. So without further ado, George.
Thank you, Vince, for introducing me. We have met several times over the last 10, 15 years, I think, and I've invited him once to lecture in Kampen, and we have also talked for a long time about being here one time and give a lecture on a certain topic. So I'm glad that we realized that plan this night. I'm going to talk to you about the Barmen Declaration and National Socialism. Ladies and gentlemen, the church as such, or the pure church, does exist in theology, but you will never meet the poor church in history. Historically speaking, the church has always been mixed with the surrounding culture and adapted itself to circumstances. So before I deal with the famous statements of the Synod of the German Confessing Church at Barmen in May 1934, I will first pay attention to the historical context in which they functioned. To do so, I will return to the beginning of the 20th century, when the modern world changed beyond recognition. As a characteristic for that world, I take doubt. Doubt of widely held certainties and of the Christian principles of the culture. Instead of the Christian worldview, an awareness of a fragmented, chaotic reality without meaning or purpose came to the fore. Germany was the eye of the storm that came over Western civilization. In the 19th century, this country had worked its way out of an inferior position and had become a military and industrial superpower. And the First World War had to be its finest hour, the definitive breakthrough of Germany as leader of the modern world under Kaiser Wilhelm II, William II. However, Germany failed to achieve its objective in this war, and after an armistice was reached in November 1918, the world punished Germany in 1919 for its aggression and ambitions with the Dictate of Versailles and with an imposed democratic Weimar Republic. The Germans were deeply disillusioned. Not only had they been deprived of their dream, but also of their honor, their history, and their future. In the 20s, a generation Germans grew up in a moral vacuum. They did not live of the truth, but of the sensational moment in which reality and imagination would converge once more. The symbol of the German at odds with his time is the figure of Mackie Messer in Bertolt Brecht's play Dreigroschenoper, the Three Pennies Opera, which had its premiere in Berlin in August 1928. This Mackie Messer, or Mac the Knife, is a gangster who is not wicked, but simply lacks virtue. With Brecht's alienating style of theatre, the theatre-goers were forced to be mere spectators, considering how things are when morality is turned upside down. The Dreigroschenoper was a great success from the start. Within a week, the opera was booked in at least 50 German theatres and was soon played to audiences throughout Europe. The jazz-like music made deep impression. The Mackie Messer or Mac the Knife ballad, composed by Kurt Weill and sung by Ella Fitzgerald, Frank Sinatra and many others, is said to be the most famous European melody of the 20th century. The Dreigroschenoper became the cult play of the German generation that grew up in the interbellum era. All the characteristics of a hype that we are familiar with emerged in this new phenomenon of mass culture for the first time. A movie was made based on the play. A Dreigroschen bar was opened in Berlin, where Dreigroschen music was played. An LP with the most popular songs from the play was produced, and you could also buy Dreigroschen wallpaper, on which the crucial scenes and main characters were depicted. This play, with its distorted morale and impact on the masses, seems like innocent theatre entertainment. But don't forget that these very same youngsters marched into Europe as National Socialists 10 years later and brought their amoral vision of reality into practice. Because what was also fascinating to this generation was the admiration for the other cult figure, Adolf Hitler. The German people were still searching for the ultimate sensation that they had wanted to achieve in the First World War. Hitler presented himself as the rescuer who promised that everything would change, and people held on tightly to his hatred of everything that was not German, all concentrated into that one metaphysically overloaded word, Jew. His total war against the Western powers was a titanic attempt to fulfill Germany's mission by the destruction of Christian civilization, or, in his own words, in history, something has to be undone, and it must begin anew, as if that which has been undone had never existed. If we typify Hitler's objective as a metaphysical mutiny, then it is clear that the Church could not ignore it. The Church was a prominent institution in Germany. The census of 1939 indicates that 54% of the Germans considered themselves as Protestants, and 40% considered themselves as Catholics. So in the Third Reich, the overwhelming majority of the Germans, that is 94%, named themselves Christian. And the majority of them were tax-paying members of a public Protestant church. Given these figures, it is clear that the Christian component in Nazi Germany is worthy of careful consideration. Because of our topic of the Barmen Declaration, we will focus on the Protestants only this night, not on the Catholics. What did the Deutsche Evangelische Kirche, the German Protestant, the large German Protestant denomination, have to say about the advancing barbarians? This church, the Evangelische Kirche, included Lutheran, Reformed, and United churches, and was not organized as a national church, but as a group of regional churches, each with their own synods, rules, and characteristics. There was no separation of church and state in the German Kaiserreich, and the Protestant Church had supported Germany's struggle to become a world power. In the Weimar Republic, after 1918, this church lost its status of public church. In this new situation, the regional churches were no longer subject to an emperor who simultaneously served as supreme bishop. Though the church leaders in general rejected the democracy of the Weimar Republic, they did not proclaim overtly their distaste. However, under the post-1918 democratic regime, the church continued to dream of a national role. It was said that the German people needed a church, quotation, like a wall that had to protect Christian culture, now that the state no longer wants to offer this protection, unquote. Most Protestants thought along German, ethnic, national and right-wing lines. And in 1932, many church members joined the German Christian movement, a semi-national socialist organization within the Evangelische Kirche. When Hitler came into power on January 30, 1933, this movement was well prepared and ready to create a new national role for the church. Hitler's National Socialist program professed a positive Christianity. This would seem contrary to Hitler's anti-Christian schemes, but it is not that straightforward. Hitler, it is true, wanted to destroy the Judeo-Christian tradition, but his ideology of Blut und Boden was at the same time narrowly connected to it. Hitler's dislike of Christian culture was born out of his disappointment about the defenselessness of Christianity in the face of modernism's fragmentation. He objected to the cultural liberalism of the Weimar Republic as much as the conservative Protestant church did. The Protestants in general disliked the religious pluralism, illustrated by the Catholic political prominence in the Republic and the new freedom the Jews enjoyed in society. But Protestant church leaders were worried about the electoral growth of the Nazi Party after 1928, especially in Protestant regions, because of its anti-Christian tendency, and because a politicized theology like that of the German Christian movement in the church might undermine the classical, non-political stand of the church. Hitler was attractive. He offered a new spiritual order, this time rooted in the blood and soil of the German people, whom he called chosen like Israel. These ultra-nationalistic ideas were congruent with the aim of the Protestant Church, which was latently anti-Semitic, and had also assigned a divine calling to the German people. Hitler's rise to power resulted in a national awakening with important religious overtones. Attendance of church services increased dramatically after January 1933. After years of decline in membership, the evangelical church rejoiced at the apparent reversal. Hitler's opening of the Reichstag in the Potsdam Garrison Church, quote, signified not only a resurgent Germany, but also the resurrection of Germany's evangelical heritage after the accelerated secularization and moral corruption of the Republican years, unquote. With the help of Hitler, the Protestant Church returned in the public domain within 6 months after the Machtübernahme, and was on the road to be reorganized into a national organization with Aryan overtones. The political revolution matched so well with the nature of German Protestantism that even the bravest future critics of National Socialism within the church, like Dietrich Bonhoeffer and Karl Barth, did not reject Hitler's new state expressly in 1933, a fact that has been glossed over to the present day. For a long time, historians assumed that there had been a rift in the relationship between church and state during the Third Reich. But this is not the case. For sure, there were protests. In September 1933, a pastors' emergency league was founded, a forerunner of the confessing church movement. These pastors had theological concerns about the blunt way the German Christian movement wanted to revitalize the church, about the exchange of the federal structure in the church for a new national structure as Reichskirche, and about their aggressive anti-Semitism and rejection of the Old Testament as Jewish. According to the confessing church, this revitalization would only be possible by preaching the Word of God and religious education. Incorporation of the church in the Nazi movement would erode the faith. But this is something else than protesting against National Socialism as such. The legitimacy of the Third Reich was not contested within the Evangelische Kirche, nor was it in the confessing church movement. The confessing church did not break away from Hitler, but believed that National Socialism should play no role in the church. Because, well, why really? It was frustrating that the German Christians manipulated the church without compunction. But the confessing church did not thwart this Nazification with respect to its content, because they were as devoted to the national and social drive of Germany as the Nazis were. The church lacked a clear view of itself, independent of nation or state, lacked a stand on democracy and totalitarianism, lacked, in short, operational confessional identity. By 1933, the last German academic publication of the text of the Reformed Confessions of Faith had not been available for decades, and popular editions did not exist at all. It was only when the National Socialist-minded German Christians already had a firm grip on the church that some groups or regions hastily formulated new definitions of the church, to which activity the confessing church owes its name. They proposed new confessions in order to contradict the views held by the German Christians. But the new confessions also were needed in support of building the Third Reich in the new era that had started with Hitler's rise to power. What did the Nazis think of these protests and the emergence of a confessing church movement within the Evangelische Kirche? In general, the Nazis projected a lasting relationship with the Protestant church. After Hitler became Reich Chancellor in 1933, he did not view the church as a rival to National Socialism, but as a partner. As a nominal Catholic, Hitler did not understand much of Protestantism and did not have the intention to interfere in church matters. But when his aim to unify the Protestant church met with considerable resistance, he decided to act. Clearly not with the intention to incorporate yet another independent institution into his totalitarian framework. In a national radio address on July 22, 1933, the night before important church elections on the national character of the Evangelische Kirche, he spoke in favor of those Protestants that, quote, unequivocally professed its allegiance to his national and Völkisch movement, unquote. As a result, several confessing church lists withdrew voluntarily from the elections out of loyalty for Hitler. The German Christians got 2/3 of the national vote. The National Socialist Bishop Müller became the elected president of the new Reich Church. Hitler's intervention had been successful, and he intended to return to his neutral position again. The German Christian movement wanted a Protestant Reichskirche. But that is more than Hitler wanted. He did not aim at a gleichgeschaltete Protestant church as part of the National Socialist state. As a matter of fact, church historian Klaus Scholder speaks about the church, quote, as a kind of free space, a place where things could be said that could be uttered nowhere else in the Third Reich, unquote. The Nazis blamed the confessing church for being politically resistant, but at the same time they realized that opposition to Bishop Müller's church policy was not the same as opposition to National Socialism. When tensions within the church grew at the end of 1933 and in 1934 because of the suppression of the confessing church movement, and even the foreign press started to protest against Bishop Müller's policy, Hitler did not want to interfere publicly again. He avoided an open conflict with the confessing church movement and replaced Bishop Müller instead, in the hope that the opposition would calm down. The British historian Ian Kershaw refers to this event as, quote, a spectacular display of what popular unrest could achieve even in the restrictive conditions of a repressive police state, unquote. However, Hitler's non-aggressive church policy also underlines that the confessing church movement was annoying to the National Socialists, annoying but never a real threat. The members of the confessing church movement, quote, never translated their protests against Nazi church policy into any other domain of Nazi governance. On the contrary, they approved of all Nazi measures in foreign and domestic affairs, unquote. The most important proposal for a new self-definition of the church was the theological declaration of the First Synod of the Confessing Church in Barmen, 1933, in May. We should be aware of three facts. First, that the Confessing Church was an opposition movement within the German Protestant Church and not an independent denomination. Secondly, that its legal position was unsecure as long as the structure of the national church with the bishop as its president was the rule. The word synod expressed a claim, no more. Thirdly, the Barmen Declaration was a compromise. This is not surprising if one takes into account that the synod was made up of Reformed Protestants and Lutherans. The latter had a high esteem of their 16th century Augsburg Confession, and therefore the Barmen text could not be called a confession. It therefore was named a theological declaration. And in addition, the church was, politically speaking, a mix of national, Social Democrat, and National Socialist members. A member of the small committee that formulated the statement in the weeks before the Synod was a Social Democrat, Karl Barth. A delegate to this Synod was the National Socialist Eduard Putz from Bavaria, a prominent party member since the days of Hitler's putsch in Munich in 1923. And among the sympathizing audience was the Nazi Kurt Gerstein. From the Nazist point of view, this synod was an innocent incident, as the confessing church movement did not resist Hitler. It only turned against those German Christians who used the church for their own ends. That is why the Barmen Declaration honors the state's special vocation in no uncertain terms. The declaration confirmed the division of responsibilities between church and state, as this had existed for ages in most of Germany. According to the Lutheran view of the two regiments of church and state, the church would not interfere in politics, while the state had the obligation to guarantee public space for the church to proclaim the gospel. At the time of the Barmen Declaration, of the Barmen Synod, the first issue, the interference of the church in state matters, was not at hand. To the contrary, the confessing church movement did its utmost best to stay politically neutral. The problem addressed in Barmen was the interference not of the state, but the interference of political ideology with church matters. This issue had for most of the members of the Synod nothing to do with their appreciation of National Socialism as such. Barmen was not a political protest. It was a theological protest against the German Christians who violated a classic division of responsibilities. The non-political character of the statement was emphasized in the official synodical explanation of the declaration. Any hint that the Barmen Declaration was directed against Hitler was denied. If we raise objections to the German Christians, so said the explanation, then we do not protest as members of a nation against recent history. Read the Machtübernahme. We do not as citizens protest against the new state. We do not as subjects protest against the government, but we protest against the same expressions that have threatened the church for 2 centuries. If we read the Barmen Declaration as it was explained in Barmen, then even Hitler could have voted in favor of it, so to speak. The National Socialists in Barmen all endorsed the declaration. There is no historical evidence that the Nazis were worried about this declaration in any way. Barmen did not fight against National Socialism, but for National Socialism. That is to say, for a new relationship between church and state within the Third Reich. Prayers were said in the Barmen Synod for those church members who were persecuted, but there were no prayers for those other imprisoned Germans, the Democrats, the Social Democrats, the Communists, or for the persecuted Jews and Catholics, or for the intellectuals that had fled Germany. They did not these people did not belong anymore to the German people, not only according to the Nazis, but also according to the confessing church. The Protestant lay people, who later on became active members of the German resistance movement against the Third Reich, hardly ever referred to Barmen to justify their resistance. And none of the delegates to the Barmen Synod joined the German resistance movement. None of them gave his life in the struggle for a better Germany. But you will ask, what about Karl Barth? The history books describe at length how he, on the 15th and 16th of May 1934, in the Hotel Baserhof in Frankfurt, quote, provided with a cup of strong coffee and 1 or 2 Brazilian cigars, unquote, wrote the very first version of the Barmen Declaration. This episode has been covered extensively in the literature on Barth and on Barmen, and rightly so. Because the Barmen Declaration was Karl Barth's greatest ecclesiastical success in his German years, and as a matter of fact, in his whole life. In 1933 and 34, the theology of the Protestant Church had come under suspicion because of the aggression of the German Christians. But there was no alternative to their theology at hand. Barth took advantage of this embarrassment and with much aplomb opened a theological offensive in the church and won a great victory for his own theology. Barmen was Barth's and Barthianism's finest hour. The broad historiographic attention for Barmen within the framework of Barth's political and theological development has a disadvantage, however. It distorted our view of Barmen in such a way that it has become customary to read the Barmen Declaration as a veiled rejection of National Socialism. That is not the case. In the first place, it primarily concerns a statement by a synod, not by a person like Barth. A statement, moreover, that was supplied with an official, non-political explanation. Moreover, I doubt whether with the Barmen Declaration, Barth wanted to oppose National Socialism as such. Seen from Barth's theological point of view, and it was this, more than it was his political insight that determined how he operated in the church in 33 and 34, the statement was nothing else but a rejection of the old evil of the intertwining of church and culture, or, theologically speaking, of Barth's old enemy, named natural theology. The reason for Barth to act in 1934 was the aggression of the German Christians, which, according to Barth's well-known brochure, Theologische Existenz heute, theological existence now, was the real danger for the church. It was not until years later that Barth explicitly framed the declaration as a choice between Christianity and National Socialism. The Barmen Declaration does not deserve praise because it rejected National Socialism on principle. Rather, it is more fitting in this case to call it a deficiency, because it failed to express that Christianity and National Socialism were incompatible, and because it failed to reject anti-Semitism. There is not a word on the exclusion, persecution, and killing of Jews in the 6th thesis of the Barmen Declaration. And what is even more revealing, every thesis opens with quotations from Scripture. But none of them was taken from the Old Testament, the book of the Jews. Historians used to speak in this context of an omission in the Barmen Declaration when it goes about Jews. But recent historiography exchanged omission for commission. But not speaking out on burning issues By not speaking out on burning issues of the day, the Barmen Synod is guilty of commitment with the Nazi regime. Or is our judgment too harsh? Was it impossible to protest openly against the totalitarian regime of the Third Reich, maybe? Of course, we have to take into account the difficult circumstances, but nonetheless, I think the main reason for not having addressed National Socialism had to do with internal tensions within the confessing church, and with the fact that quite a few aims of the National Socialists, anti-Semitism, racial hygiene, euthanasia, and an aggressive foreign policy had a resonance to those who sided with the confessing church. There is reason to speculate about the possibility of a more outspoken, antithetical Barmen Declaration. I have three reasons for this opinion. The first is that the confessing church in 1934 was something like a mass movement. It was not an isolated protest of some elite church leaders, but a powerful reaction grounded in many local congregations. The confessing church movement was well known, enjoyed international support, and was in a better position to speak out against National Socialism than any other group ever in the years 1933-1945. The second reason to consider the possibility of a more outspoken Barmen Declaration is that mass protest did have effect, even in a totalitarian state like the Third Reich. In 1934, the house arrest of Bishop Hans Meiser of Bavaria, who had opposed the Christian German movement, was met by protests of large crowds. This worried Hitler, and he personally ordered Meiser's immediate release and fired a church leader. And when in 1941 the Catholic bishop Clemens August von Galen publicly denunciated the Nazi euthanasia program, the Nazis were outraged. But Joseph Goebbels withheld himself from intervention for, quote, if anything were done against the bishop, the population of Münster could be regarded as lost to the war effort. And the same could confidently be said of the whole of Westphalia, unquote. These examples make clear that the confessing church actually was in the position to speak out against Hitler. And thirdly, the repression of the Nazis was not so much directed against the church as well as against the political left, religious and ethnical minorities, the racially and genetically suspect, and the socially marginalized. And this repression depended upon the willingness of the average German to comply. This means there were limits to the Nazi repression, as Shelley Baranovsky states. But in the case of the Barmen Declaration, these limits were neutralized by the failure to challenge the legitimacy of the Third Reich. The Barmen Synod did not strengthen the weak position of the Church regarding National Socialism, and by not speaking out was instrumental in making room for the National Socialist Revolution and its dark results. In Protestant churches all over the world, the Barmen Declaration enjoys the status of an anti-National Socialist document. But how was Barmen received in its own days? Let's focus on the Netherlands, a small neighboring country west of Germany. The Netherlands had been neutral during the First World War, and their economic and moral situation was not as bad as in Germany. But the Dutch were also affected by the fragmentation of culture and the search for a new community as represented by communism, fascism, and National Socialism. And there too, the changing cultural climate took its toll. The theologian Klaas Schilder was a typical representative of the modern interwar generation. He belonged to the Reformed churches in the Netherlands, founded by Abraham Kuyper and Herman Bavinck at the end of the 19th century. What was so modern about Schilder's convictions? Three things. First, many Reformed theologians stuck to the Kuyperian structures, but he was convinced of the crisis of culture, just like Hitler, just like Barth. Theology had to start anew. Secondly, he had a renewed interest in the church. This may not sound typically modern, but think of the moral deprivation of the Dreigroschenoper. Hitler was in line with this play with his unscrupulous Wille zur Macht, but he also satisfied the Germans' search for community by stressing their Aryan race. Schilder and Karl Barth replied to the moral vacuum and the search for community by stressing the importance of the church. But while Barth situated the church over against culture and emphasized its Jenseitigkeit, Schilder emphasized the church as the preserver of culture and humanity. In the third place, Schilder accentuated the totality or unity of life as opposed to modern fragmentation. Total was a word that was in vogue at the time. There was a total war. There was a totalitarian state, a total theater of Brecht. The slogan coined by Schilder, that life is one, stems from this climate. Schilder departed from the Kuyperian compartmentalization of life in church, school, and party as independent spheres. He stressed the dynamism of the Christian community as a whole. But what this meant in practice became clear from Schilder's criticism of Barth's attitude and that of the confessing church towards National Socialism. In his opinion, Barth did not oppose the National Socialist state, but merely asked for an independent place for the church within that state. In Barth's brochure, Für die Freiheit des Evangeliums, for the freedom of the gospel, that was published in October 1933, it, according to Schilder, quote, is clearly stated that the freedom of the gospel, for which Barth has thrown himself into the breach, is not threatened by the current National Socialist state, unquote. He completely disagreed with Barth. Quote, because I assert that the National Socialist state does in fact limit the freedom of the gospel, that it immediately deprives it, that it is incompatible with what the Christian church, in as far as it is a Christian church, must want and preach. Does Barth fight Hitler? There is not a shred of evidence for it. Against Barth, we will persist that the church and the gospel really do have to intervene in the worldview and the morals of the day, and then must resolutely reject certain state structures and encourage those wanted by God. Unquote. Schilder's view was not paid much attention to, and when after the war the myth was presented that the confessing church movement had actively resisted National Socialism, his opinion was forgotten. But the newer historiography supports Schilder's opinion about Barth's position in 1933. But what did Schilder himself do within his church when National Socialism made its way into the Netherlands? Unlike Barth and the confessing church, he did not wait for a National Socialist group within the church to grow in power, but proposed the Synod of the Reformed Churches of 1936 to denounce the small Dutch National Socialist Party within the church and to reject it in general. After all, a dynamic church had not only to protect itself, but the community as a whole. Schilder's modern approach was opposed in his church by those who defended the widely held opinion that a church could never condemn a political party, but only speak out against its own church members joining that party. A complementary reference was made by some Dutchmen to the Synod of Barmen, which had not given a political statement, but had only stated in general that state absolutism was idolatry, and that the idea of totality wronged Christ's rights over his church. The Dutch National Socialists took advantage of this disagreement among the Reformed and stressed that membership of their party did not require any violation of Christian morals. Despite this opposition, the Synod of 1936 became Schilder's finest hour in the Reformed churches, comparable to Barth's victory in Barmen. Both National Socialism and individual party membership were denounced by the Dutch Synod. In the historiography, Schilder and the Reformed churches were praised for their early and radical rejection of National Socialism. The question now remains as to whether Amsterdam, the Synod of Amsterdam, was a step forward in comparison with Barmen. My answer is a mixed one. Yes, the Amsterdam statement was better than in that it was both more antithetical and more concrete than the Barmen Declaration. It rightly stated that the church should not aim at an exemption from the National Socialist system, but that it should reject National Socialism, not only in the church, but also in the state, in the press, in the schools, and in all of life. But like in the case of Barmen, we asked what would have happened. We ask what would have happened if the declaration had been more explicit. We now have to ask, in the Amsterdam case, how would we have judged the Amsterdam decision if not the Second World War had succeeded? There is a reason for this question. The Amsterdam Synod had been warned not to speak out on specific political parties and organizations, because if the church would start interfering with life in its broadest sense in this way, where would the end be? Why not also denounce communism? And why not denounce certain movies and books, etc.? Schilder reacted to this warning, not to become a totalitarian church, with a reference to the famous quote from Kuyper, geen duim breed. There is not a square inch in all domains of life of which Christ, the sovereign over all, does not say, mine. But this quote is about Christ, not about the church. Schilder's argument, however, was that the National Socialist Party was not just a political party, but a semi-religious movement with totalitarian claims that was of direct concern to a dynamic church with an all-encompassing life view. Schilder was focused on what for him was the only real conflict, that concerning principles. Political parties and political issues were of secondary importance to him. Liberals, communists, Nazis, to him every distinguishing feature faded in the political gloom. Undoubtedly, Schilder's principle in Amsterdam pushed away the political reality. So, in being more directed to the actual context of the church, the Amsterdam statement overlooked political realities and neglected the variety and independence of life outside the church. Another question is, whether the exclusion of political parties by the church is not at odds with the acceptance of democracy, a political system that is based on the acceptance of mutually exclusive principles. In 1933, Schilder wrote about the state structures that God wanted. In this case, it's not clear whether he was thinking of democracy, but later on in the 30s, he spoke out more clearly in favor of democracy. In 1939, Schilder was the first Reformed theologian who explicitly defended democracy, using the biblical image of the wheat and the darnel that grow together in the field and are not separated before harvest day, that is, Judgment Day. It is clear that in 1939, Schilder's ideas about the preferred state structure were not ruled by his total church vision as in Amsterdam, but by his aversion of dictatorships. However, it is not clear how this defense of democracy on principle can be brought in line with the rejection of political parties who endorse the democratic order. In this light too, the statement made in Amsterdam is complicated and can hardly serve as a leading principle for political comments made by the Church today. Now we have evaluated the stance of the Barmen Declaration and the Amsterdam Statement. I'd like to make some closing remarks. The first one is that we don't have to choose between either position. Doing history is not in the first place about who is right and who is wrong, but about understanding which problems people in former days were facing and why they offered the solutions they did. Secondly, realize that historiography is a debate that never ends, and that moral positions and sympathies are part and parcel of history writing. Be aware that it is likely that someone who sides with the theology of Barth or Schilder will defend Barmen or Amsterdam, but that history cannot be reduced to theological positions. Thirdly, Hitler, Barth, and Schilder acted in a context where moral foundations were crushed. Hitler's solution to this existential problem was a destruction of Christian culture and start afresh with a new set of values. This was the largest threat Barth and Schilder were facing. Barth's solution was to concentrate on God's word and the church alone. Barmen is about rejecting any other solution but Christ. The disadvantage of this solution was in the short run that it made room for a national socialist society, and in the long run that it gave up on culture. Schilder's solution was opposing National Socialism in every aspect, and have the church act as the battery of a contrasting Christian culture. In the short run, this was the most effective solution. Dutch resistance during World War II was not in the last place inspired by Schilder's ideas, and Schilder himself was captivated and was captured and put into prison by the Germans. In the long run, however, the disadvantage of his solution was an underestimate of the independence of other spheres and an overestimate of the role of the church. The fourth and last remark brings us back to the Dreigroschenoper and the turning upside down of morality in the interbellum era. The cases of Barth and Schilder show that Christian life is not about not engaging with culture. Culture engages with you, whether you want it or not, whether you realize it or not. The morality of Mac the Knife in the play became the Nazi rule in Germany and in the Netherlands. Christian life is about understanding and shaping the Word of God within a specific cultural context. In this respect, both Barmen and Amsterdam, and history in general, is there to reflect on our own morality and cultural presence, and to train us to make the right choices. Thank you.
Questions?
Well, I'd like to say that this was very, very fine analysis, and I would say I agree with it.
Okay, thank you.
But I have a number of questions just about clarification along the way. One question, again, you touched briefly on Bonhoeffer, and
Yeah.
I'd like to know what your feeling is about how much Bonhoeffer was affected in terms of Barth's understanding of how the church is to be, in a sense, separated from the culture. Do we see that played out in Bonhoeffer, or do we see this whole question of culture being a very important factor in the way we understand what Bonhoeffer was trying to do in this particular period? That's one question I have in terms of...
Yeah. Well, as to Bonhoeffer, he was not a part of this Barmen Synod as Karl Barth was. Of course, he knew about it and he followed it closely, but he was not active in this. And I think he was attracted, interested by the theology of Karl Barth. But I think that after 1933, I don't think that he had a very clear stand on the issue of the church in 1933, though his dissertation is already, of course, about the community. And he didn't have a clear stand on National Socialism either, I think, in 1933. That was developing at that time. But if you look to Bonhoeffer, my impression is that Bonhoeffer was very much, of course, realizing that the church was there in a world that had turned away from the church, and how to reach out to the people. But different from Barth in these years, Barth also changed his position, but different from Barth in these years is that Bonhoeffer, I think, tried to formulate a function for the church in this secular world. I think he did it in a different way than Schilder or the neo-Calvinists did it, and different than Karl Barth. I think he more started he came with the idea of the church as a more or less sacred community, a very small and sacred community with high thresholds. You could not just become a member of the church. That was a sacred community, and that the church members should be active, not as church members, but should be active in society and there represent Christ. So he stuck to a connection between the church and culture, but he did it in an indirect way. The church as such should not enter culture or speak out in culture. No, it was a kind of a closed community, and the members had to go out into culture. Not as church members, but the church, that church community was a kind of a battery. So these members were loaded with, let's say, religious electricity and went into society and did their job. And just by doing their job, they communicated the message of the church. But so he tried to keep a connection. He was looking for a new connection between church and culture. I don't know. I'm not a Bonhoeffer scholar, so.
I appreciate those comments very much. I don't. If there's others that have questions. No, go ahead. I'm just. We'll go. Why don't we change them here?
All right. Well, yeah, thank you very much, Dr. Harinck. I appreciate it. I must admit that for me, this is quite a different reading of those events than I have come to know myself in my own study and teaching. And I think that it's a helpful reminder that it's no doubt that there are aspects of Barmen that Barth himself noted could have been improved. I mean, he lamented, of course, the silence with regard to anti-Semitism later in his career. And I think I think you're right to say that it's absolutely a theological statement, not first and foremost a political one. But you know, I guess my first sort of basic question is how though would you respond to comments that Barth himself made shortly thereafter? And I'm thinking at this point of the end of paragraph 26 in the Church Dogmatics, volume 2.1, where he specifically mentions in his reflections on Barmen that, as you mentioned, does have to do with a response to natural theology generally, but specifically has to do with National Socialism. So I guess that's my first. And this is not that long after. I mean, it's a couple
No,
years.
it's at 35, 36, I think.
Yeah, 36. It was on top of my. Of course, he's in Bonn at the time that he's writing, you know, that he's writes Barmen and all that is going on, and shortly thereafter he's forced to leave because of his opposition to, you know, his refusal to take part in the, Nazi.
I don't know exactly when he did write that passages, but the book was published after he had been fired.
Yes.
So he was in Switzerland at that time already. Well, I think that Karl Barth very soon after Barmen interpreted Barmen in his own way and from his own position. It's fully clear, and we have to praise Karl Barth for that he, as a person, was very brave, and he dared to oppose, and he dared to refuse to give that oath that was required from him. But so his situation in 1935 was that he was the most famous opponent to National Socialism when he had to leave Germany, etc. And at that time, he interpreted Barmen in that way. But as I said, the official explanation at Barmen denied any relationship between the thesis and the National Socialist state. It was not about the National Socialist state, it was about natural theology. So, and that's something, of course, you might argue that this was already the idea of Karl Barth in May 1934. Possible. We don't know that, and we don't find that in his letters at that time. But it is possible that you could argue in that way, and that you could say, but he could not speak out, for if he had done so at the Barmen Synod would never have accepted the Barmen Declaration. And that was his aim. So he kept his mouth shut at the Synod. That's possible. But we have no evidence for that.
It's hard for me to, I appreciate that, thank you, but it's hard for me to read in Barmen, you know, that Jesus Christ is the one word we are have to, hear and obey and like that. And knowing the context at the time, and knowing, you know, the involvement of various members, I think you've done a good job of talking about the complexity of the Confessing Church movement, but knowing the context at the time, it's hard for me to read that and not hear in the background Jesus Christ is the one word, not any other, not i.e. Hitler.
Of course.
So,
of course.
I guess
that's the way we have learned to read the Barmen Declaration.
But just because something doesn't say, just because it doesn't come out in one of its theses, it says, and therefore we directly oppose Hitler and the National Socialist Party.
No. But of course, I can understand that people tend to relate this. If Christ is the one, then Hitler is not the one. That's clear. But if Karl Barth says in 1933 that Christ is the one, he means and not natural, and not like natural theology, another source of revelation like nature, and that's, for example, against Emil Brunner. He had written the brochure 9 just before, and Brunner was not a National Socialist. So it is this ongoing fight with natural theology, in my opinion.
Yeah, and you're right. I mean, he characterized it as such in paragraph 26, but specifically mentions the National Socialist Party. So I guess that's why I'm.
Yeah. Well, it is so, but I tend to pay attention to the chronology then and say, well, that's afterwards. And I can understand it. And I know that in various newspaper articles, also in England, etc., Karl Barth wrote, Barmen was an attack on National Socialism. And we have accepted that interpretation, but I doubt if that's right. If you focus, of course, on the Barmen Declaration, as I did now, on 1934. I know that Barth changed his position. I also know that Barth acknowledged that something had been missing in the Barmen Declaration, which I personally also appreciate very much. I don't know very many people who admit that kind of things. So it's rather courageous. It's a high morale that he comes back on his own word and says, "Well, I've missed that." But then again, he spoke in terms of omission, and historians now speak in terms of commission.
That he intentionally...
No, not intentionally, but by not speaking out, you gave room to the National Socialists. That's the way Goldhagen argues about the willing executioners, for example. That's in the historiography. Because of the Germans keeping their mouth shut and just complying, they made room for the Holocaust.
Just to pick up on that briefly, there does seem to be, and I don't know whether this is what you're referring to, but in the Barmen Declaration, the 1934 Declaration, there does seem to be what could be taken as references to the opposition to the national, what was happening in the National Party. I quote here from Article 2, in view of the destructive errors of the German Christians and the present national church government, we pledge ourselves to the following evangelical truths.
Yeah.
Now, do you take that to mean, in other words, the way in which the political situation was developing with regard to church leadership rather than to the national Socialist Party?
It's very precisely formulated. It's about the church government. It's about Bishop Muller. It's about Bishop Muller. And it's not about the politics. And it could never have been about the politics because the National Socialists, some of them even in uniform, were present at the Barmen Synod. Openly National Socialists. They were present and they voted for this declaration.
My final question had to do with clarifying again where the Jews came in to the whole picture here. In other words, you did allude to this in your presentation.
Yeah. Well, Karl Barth himself. Yeah. Karl Barth himself admitted afterwards, I should have spoken out on the Jews in Barmen. And in 1984, when the 50 years Barmen Declaration was celebrated, Pinchas Lapide, a Jew, attacked Barth for this. And rightly so, I think. But, of course, you can discuss again, did the Barmens, the people at Barmen know what was going on at that time? Well, we know that there's evidence enough that shows that every German knew what was happening to the Jews, excluded, put in prison. I take the example of Schilder. He studied in Germany at the time that the Machtübernahme was there. He defended his dissertation in March 1933, so that's 6 weeks after Hitler came into power. In these 6 weeks, he had seen all the Jews taken from the university. He has seen a Jew beaten to death in the streets. He had another PhD student he was working with. He knew in March 1933 that he was in Dachau. And what he did not know at that time, he was dead already. So Germans knew what was going on with the Jews. But they agreed. They just agreed. maybe you should not beat them to death. But the Jews should be excluded. The Jews, there was a very anti-Semitic mood, not just in Germany, by the way, also in France, also in the Netherlands, it was there. And one of the first who started raising questions about it, not opposing it yet, but is, for example, Bonhoeffer, who in 1933 in a radio talk raised questions about it. What should the church think about the Jews? Well, but that was not clear at that moment, and in Barmen there was no issue. Of course. We are Germans, we are Aryans, and the Jews are hindering us, to say it frankly. So there was no question that in 1933 Barmen could have said anything about the Jews. Impossible.
Can I ask briefly, unless there was other?
Well, I have a question. One of the. There was a picture of Goebbels' mortality. So what? Yeah.
Oh, this one. Sorry.
Yeah.
Well, this is an illustration of the popularity of the word total.
Oh.
Total war.
Yeah.
A total church.
Yeah.
The unity of life.
Yeah.
So in 43, Goebbels used the word total.
Yeah.
That's just an illustration. That was in this speech, famous speech. Yeah. Okay.
I was just wondering about the reception of your thesis. How have you, how in your experience has that been received?
It has never been very well received. Well, not that people oppose or give me arguments that made me rethink, but they just are not used to this interpretation. So some people say, well, I have to rethink this, or I have to reread, or I have to take into account the new historiography, which I don't know, and you know. That's right. And the Barthians, so the people who, let's say, believe in Karl Barth, they just neglect it and they ignore it and they say, you are anti-Barthian and that's it. Well, I'm not anti-Barthian. I think it's as I said before, I think he was very brave, and he is a very interesting figure in this whole complex situation. But I don't think that the Barmen Declaration was directed against National Socialism. That's the only thing I say. But well, they don't take it.
Would you say that your thesis, and I don't know how much you've been able to articulate this outside of your more immediate Dutch context, but would you say that it's been received better in a Dutch context than in other?
No.
Okay.
It's as worse as elsewhere. No, but no, as worse. Of course, I'm making a joke now, but no, the people in the Netherlands react about the same as you here, or I gave this lecture at Fuller. They gave the same kind of reaction. I gave it in Princeton. They gave the same.
Clarify where you gave it in Princeton.
Okay, I came to give this lecture in Princeton, and it happened to be that, if you know something about Karl Barth, Eberhard Busch was there. Eberhard Busch is the biographer of Karl Barth, and more than that. So then the president said, well, that lecture is fine, but don't give it in public. So I gave it in a house of one of the professors, just not to offend Eberhard Busch. which was interesting, but yeah.
I guess I was wondering because I thought that, I was thinking that perhaps there might be more appreciation for it in circles that might be more influenced by a Kapperian theology of this sort of more distinction.
Yeah, well, that's
lend
true.
itself more towards the separation of the theological and the political.
That's true. I have to admit that. I already pointed to the fact that the theologian Schilder is more in line with the present historiography. Yeah. But then again, the neo-Calvinists don't like the fact that I'm also critical of Amsterdam. I think it's very tricky when a church speaks out on just a concrete political party. And as a matter of fact, I couldn't go into that, but the Amsterdam Synod spoke out on two parties, the National Socialist Movement and the Christian Democratic Union. which was a party with Barthian overtones. And they were pacifist. And that was not in line with the Caperian ideas. So I think the church went on a wrong way in 1936 by pointing to concrete political parties. You may not be member of that party, you may not be member of that party. Well, that doesn't work. That's why I asked, where does that end? You may not go to that movie, you may not read that book. That's not what the church should I think a church should do. So there is in general, in the historiography, is a very much praise for the Amsterdam Synod. But I am critical, again, about the only one, I'm critical of the Amsterdam Synod. So that's why the neo-Calvinists, they are positive, of course, of my critique on Karl Barth, but not positive on my critique on Amsterdam. And I have to add to this that historians in general agree with my view. I'm a historian myself. I'm not a theologian. So historians in general say, oh, you were right on that. It's the theologians, it's the church members that disagree. Yeah.
Hey, it's also quite fair to say, or do you think it's fair to say that the historical momentum of the particular interpretation of Barmen also, so I mean, because you know, when you tell me that, when I'm going to get out of this train, hey, what was your lecture about? You tell me what it was. I mean, I mean, I don't have a category for what you were talking about.
But that has to do.
What do you mean? You
No,
know,
but that has to do with the fact that we in the church, or we as theologians, have learned to interpret Barmen in this Barthian context, and not only the Barthian context. After the Second World War, till deep in the 1980s, the general view was that the confessing church was opposing Hitler, which they never did. Well, that's that was in the historiography. That was the official view, and the people were praised for it. Well, I have told you, no one who was in Barmen was active in the war, building for a better Germany. That's a democratic Germany. They were not active in that because they were not interested in democracy. They were interested in the future of Germany with the church in a central position. The people that died in the war, and there, as you know, there was small, but we have to praise that, there was Protestant resistance in the Third Reich. Bonhoeffer was part of that. And Bonhoeffer himself, of course, died for this resistance against Hitler. But everyone who died had nothing to do with Barmen. None of these about 200 members of the Barmen Synod was in any way related to the resistance. And it's even worse. The confessing church refused to pray for Bonhoeffer in the war. They prayed every Sunday, the confessing churches. They prayed every Sunday for the people who were persecuted and were in prison, with name and all. There was a list. Bonhoeffer never appeared on that list. Why so? Because he opposed Hitler. That you should not do. That's the reason. But if you think about that, you start changing your mind and changing your ideas about this confessing church. What was this really about? We easily have thought that it was against Hitler, but it was not against Hitler. They left Bonhoeffer alone. Well, of course, you can also discuss, today we talk about Bonhoeffer as a saint. Well, maybe that goes too far. We make him maybe too big. But we have to admit, he did not die by accident. He died because he resisted Hitler. He paid the price for it. The confessing church never.
So is there a final question for George?
No, I just wonder what floor and what building are you in at the university?
What do you mean by that?
Well, when I was there visiting back in the early 70s and had a wonderful conversation with Professor Kuiper.
Okay.
I think he was...
Professor Kuiper would agree with me.
Yes.
Yeah.
Well, I
I have to explain on that. I am a member of the Department of Theology.
Oh,
I'm a professor in the Arts Department and in the Theology Department. But my room is on the second floor.
Oh.
If you want to know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Good.
Okay.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.